So we'll turn first to Alan.
As was mentioned, I've been working in Miami and on issues of integration of immigrants into Miami for a very long time, 37 years now. Just before that, I was actually in Washington and worked in Congress and worked on what became the 1986 Immigration Reform, but actually specifically got involved with issues of Cuban immigration refugees and happened to be ultimately involved in the Elion event that you referred to there, or an intimate observer, anyway, not directly involved in it. What I'm going to report on today, I'm doing with a little bit of trepidation. It's based on a Pew Charitable Trust funded project. It was called the Gateway Cities Project, and I headed up the Miami component of it. And it was designed to look at immigrants and religion and civic engagement issues. And so in some respects, what I'm doing this with trepidation because all the first stuff was all policy type stuff. This is more academic. For those of you in policy, I hope it's not too boring, you know. And I hope there's a little bit of policy relevant stuff to it. In one way, it's definitely complementary to what went on before. The first part was very Washington-centric, the first half of this thing. And this is the opposite. This is a grassroots, bottom-up perspective on religious communities and immigrant integration. And I'm going to introduce this concept that we came up with in this project called Civic Social Capital. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with social capital that Robert Putnam made very famous in the 1990s. This is a slight alteration of that. And I'm going to then focus on what I think are the two most significant elements that came out of our research that predict and help determine whether or not immigrant religious organizations or communities become involved in politics in general, civic engagement even more generally. And first is context of reception. That is the host society's attitudes and behaviors. And secondly is the role of leadership. And we'll come back to those to explain exactly what I mean by those. First, what is civic social capital? First, civic, I mean social relations beyond one's family and those who are socially similar to you, beyond the people you're most familiar with. And the social capital notion is an extension, for those of you who know this literature, Coleman, Bourdieu, and the reformulation of Putnam. For those of you who don't know it, don't worry about it. I'll try to summarize it for you. But there are different kinds of social capital. Bonding, bridging, and linking. And the bonding one is represented on that graph of the little circle of, basically it's all the people who are really like you, who are most similar to you, that you feel really close to. Bridging is moving beyond that immediate group, but in a sideways fashion, to people who are somewhat different, but basically have the same level of power and resources that you have. And then finally, linking is moving up to people who are both different in culture and social, and also have different access to resources. So civic social capital doesn't include bonding. It's the bridging to people who are somewhat different from you, and the linking part to people who have more resources than you have. Now, bonding to social capital is something that religious communities are great at. You know, and immigrant religious communities especially spend a lot of time doing bonding type exercises. Every single congregation that we studied in Miami, and we studied about 30 of them intensively for over 2 years, engaged in lots of bonding type activities that brought people who are already similar, shared a religion, generally shared an ethnic and cultural background, brought them close together. Bridging, as I said, were people who are socially different to you. Religious organizations do two kinds of that. Spiritual kind, which is the evangelization that was mentioned in the first session this morning, but they also, especially in immigrant communities, do a lot of material bridging social capital. Through service organizations, through volunteerism. We also did research among the college students at my university, the International University, which is the local state university in Miami, the largest university in the state. As is reflected in nationwide surveys, college students do a lot of volunteering these days. College students in Miami do a lot of volunteering that relates to immigrants. Not surprising, because many of them are from immigrant backgrounds themselves. So that's a kind of bridging social capital. And for immigrant who are newly arrived, it's a critical resource. It's the way people frequently find jobs, find housing, learn how to get their kids enrolled in school. And for immigrants, many of whom are extraordinarily religious, not all, of course, some of them are unaffiliated ones, but many of them are religious, and very frequently they get this kind of information in their religious organization. And the last one is the linking to people who are socially different and have different amounts of power. And again, for those of you who are academically inclined, there's a famous sociological article by Granovetter called the strength of weak ties. That is, ties to people that you don't see every day, you don't see them very often, but they have access to resources that you don't have. So they're weak in the sense that you're not close to them all the time, but they're really critical because they have some resources that they can help you with. That's linking social capital. That one is the least common in general in our social interactions, and specifically in the religious congregations that we study. But if we look at all of the religious organizations that we study, to give you a brief summary here, all of them engage in this bonding social capital, as I already said. The service and volunteering, nearly all of them do that on a local level. They do evangelization, they share resources, and the students, as I said, do lots of volunteering type work. Some of them do it, service and volunteering, at a national level, but especially the youth. The youth are much more inclined to do that. And as you might guess, if any of you can see this bottom line down here, one of the things that's real big in migration studies is the emergence of transnational communities and transnational social relations. Not surprising, immigrant congregations engage in lots of transnational religious activities, bringing pastors from their home country to give sermons. When there are disasters like the Haitian earthquake, earlier in Nicaraguan hurricanes, they send aid via the congregation back home. So there's lots of that transnational activities. But what's really critical here, I think, in terms of civic engagement and the kind of stuff that we were talking about in the first sessions, is linking social capital in what we might call formal politics, which would specifically concern whether or not comprehensive immigration reform is going to take place. Those of you who are familiar with the literature know that in the literature at looking at the relationship between religion and politics, there's a statement that mainline Protestants and Catholics and Jews also are more likely to engage in formal politics of linking social acts like that. And the statement is that evangelicals are less likely to engage in that kind of research. However, we discovered that that's not an absolute truth. We had one evangelical congregation that we studied that was extraordinarily civically engaged. And it was, particularly was a local civic engagement actually working in drug and alcohol abuse and rehabilitation. So, and similarly, although mainstream Protestants and Catholics are more likely to be civically engaged, they were not all civically engaged. As was mentioned in the earlier session, many of the Catholic priests are on board with comprehensive immigration reform, but not all of them. Not all of them take it as a important issue. And so we looked at, well then, what distinguishes why some are involved and others aren't involved? And that's where, as I said before, context of reception and leadership make the difference. So specifically, context of reception is this concept that's used in immigration studies to refer to the social, political context that confronts migrants when they arrive. And basically, it's how does the host society treat the immigrants. So much about immigrant assimilation makes it seem as if assimilation depends entirely on how the immigrants act. But it turns out that it also depends on how the society treats the immigrants and how they respond. So, in particular, a good contrast in Miami is the difference between Cubans and Haitians. When Cubans first started coming to the United States in the 1960s, the United States government enlisted the Catholic Church to assist in their integration. And the Catholic Church became a critical institutional body in helping Cubans integrate. And it can be said without too much exaggeration that Cubans made the Catholic Church in Miami. Even though, ironically, Cubans are one of the least churched people in Latin America, even before Fidel, they did not go to church very often, the Catholic Church became a critical institution because the US government empowered it. It gave it resources to allow them to help the immigrants become integrated into the United States. The contrast, of course, is the Haitians. I frequently say that the Haitians are the most discriminated group in immigration in the United States, and contemporarily, sometimes in the wake of 9/11, Muslims may have given them some run for their money for being the most discriminated against group, so they're amongst them. They have never been welcomed, and so they've had a much more difficult time integrating into the United States. And in those conditions, when the U.S. government, U.S. society more generally does not have a positive context, but instead has a negative context of reception, then leadership is critical. Then you need effective leaders who embody linking social capital. And in religious terms, this is what Max Weber called prophets. People who have charisma and who have the divine inspiration with a social vision and lead by example. And in Miami, we had a number of people like that, one of whom I'm sure was known to some people in the earlier session, Father Thomas Wensky, who is now the Archbishop of Miami, was the founding director of Notre Dame d'Haïti, which is the church that serves the Haitian community in Miami. And he made it a leading organization, and he was an engaged priest who got his congregation involved socially, civically, and he is now doing the same thing as Archbishop. If you follow any of Latin American news, he's been in Cuba a lot recently. He's working very hard in similar types of things. So in that sense, he is, in Weber's sense, a prophet. You know, he has charisma, and he has divine inspiration with a social vision, and he leads by example. And given the description we heard in the earlier session, we may have another one for the Southern Baptist here, who does exactly the same thing in the area of immigration. He uses scripture, divine inspiration, to convey a social vision, in this case specifically about immigrants. Again, for those of you who are interested in social theory, Bourdieu is also relevant to this, because we also have the leaders also need to have a habitus that is in conjunction with the followers, and that was part of the discussion this morning of when you go to the Hill, they say, well, that's what you say, but your followers actually agree with you. And we do have examples in our researchers of where the leaders tried to lead and the followers refused to follow them. So the leaders have to know, not only have the divine inspiration and the social vision, but they have to know how to relate to their followers to lead them along. So you need all of those aspects to be an effective leader in this area. So there's an interaction between the mode of incorporation and the leadership. The positive incorporation of Cubans reduces actually the need for charismatic leaders. The resources that the U.S. government gave to the Catholic Church allowed the Cubans to integrate relatively successfully without having to have outstanding, dramatic, prophetic type leaders. They have some anyway, you know, and some of them are religious, but they're not at the same level as Archbishop Wensky is, for example. There's less of a need when the government or when the context of reception is positive. But when there's a negative context of reception, then you much more likely need charismatic leaders with linking social capital in order to get immigrant congregations integrated and involved in civic social capital. So in summary, and I zipped through this because we have many other speakers to go through and it's late in the afternoon. Civic social capital then are relations beyond one's family, and those who are socially similar. It depends primarily on context of reception, how the migrants are received, that is how the host society and civil society responds to, manages diversity, and that there is frequently a contest over imposed, constructed, ethnic, national, essentialist ideas, which I didn't get into here, but it is an issue of whether all Hispanics are alike in Miami, for example, or whether African Americans and Haitians deserve solidarity together, or whether all immigrants are alike. And then finally, the last point is that leadership is a critical factor in being able to get immigrants integrated successfully in civic terms. So that's it. Thank you.
Right there. Thank you. I enjoyed that. Thank you. Go back over here. Well, that presentation was particularly interesting to me for a couple of reasons. I was born and raised in Miami. I don't remember any of this. I moved away in 1961. I finished high school.
Right when it began to change.
Right when it began to change. That's exactly right. In fact, I grew up about 3 miles from your Miami campus. Then it was a hard difference. I'm Raleigh Bailey. I apologize for coming in sort of late. I've been looking forward to this. As my wife and I left this morning, I was planning a leisurely trip up, sightseeing along the way, to be here for the conference tomorrow. She looked at the agenda and pointed out that I had put it in on the wrong day. So we've been going 80 miles an hour for the last 4 hours. We just made it. I would like to speak specifically to the 3 questions that Elzbieta has posed. I should explain a little bit about my role and how I see it, though it says I'm senior research scientist at the university. I think of myself more as a facilitator. Our center bridges the gap between community organizations and the academic researchers. So we often put the academics in touch with the immigrant communities and give them access. We literally provide interpretation. We actually have our giant AmeriCorps program with about 75 members is called Access. And so a lot of our focus is on that. And my secret agenda with that is that it's a social justice agenda. As these academics get involved with the community, they themselves become transformed. And in fact, their interventions facilitate equitable integration. I'm saying the academics, I'm also including students. Let me focus my comments really on North Carolina, and I'll tell you a little bit about North Carolina, and a lot of the examples will come from Guilford County and the city of Greensboro, which is exactly in the center of the state. And what you should know about North Carolina is we are considered sort of a moderate southern state, not as backward as some, but not cutting edge of progress either. We are in what has been typically called the Bible Belt, and that's important for our discussion today. North Carolina saw itself strictly as black and white. We weren't aware of the Native Americans or the Latino farm workers. And that really didn't begin to change until after the Vietnam War and Southeast Asian refugees began to come into the state. And that was the first time we really, as a state, began to think in terms of integration of newcomers in that kind of sense. What happened in North Carolina after the Refugee Resettlement Act of 1980, 2 BOLAGs, 2 refugee resettlement agencies, initially became active, and they covered the whole state. One was the Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service, BOLAG, and the other was the U.S. Catholic Conference, now Catholic Conference of Bishops. And between the 2 of them, they split up the state, and they adopted what is essentially a modified congregational model of refugee resettlement. They tapped into local congregations to find their energy, their volunteers, their bridge builders, and their money to help newcomer communities. In North Carolina, you couldn't build on the existing immigrant community because it wasn't there in the early days. So in the 80s, the refugee program in North Carolina really took off by resettling initially Southeast Asians and some significant groups there, and then gradually spreading out into the other groups. The resettlement was done mainly in the more urban areas. Greensboro, which I will cite, probably would be considered the primary resettlement site. Charlotte is close to it in numbers, but Greensboro currently has 4 BOLAGs operating with offices. Charlotte has 2. The city of Raleigh has 1. The city of Asheville has 1. So in those first few years, most of the refugees were resettled in Greensboro and in Charlotte, and then as another office opened in Raleigh, they were settled there. The Guilford County, which is the site of Greensboro, Guilford County schools now claim approximately 150 first languages in the school system, which is not impressive for Washington, but it's very impressive for North Carolina. And I think that the other cities don't have quite that many, but they're following, particularly the urban areas, because refugees were concentrated, especially in those 3 or 4 or 5 key cities. Based on the success of those, that first decade of the 80s, other gulags began to move into the state, so that we went from 2 till now we have 8. And of the 8, I think it's 8, 5 or 6 of them are faith community based. And they include LIRS, Lutheran Immigration, Church World Service, World Relief Refugee Services, U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, HIAS, and one that I'm forgetting will come to me, and then only 2 others that are not faith-based. African Services Coalition is a sub-grantee of Ethiopian Community Development, and USCRI, which doesn't quite make that kind of faith statement in its claims. So these are Presiding Bishops Fund, Episcopalians was the other. So all of these were active in the state, and they migrated there because North Carolina developed a very positive record, meaning from the federal government point of view, refugees became self-sufficient. That means the measure of success. The integration has gone as well as I would think it could be expected, though people do not really achieve economic status, particularly with the large number of people coming from tribal societies, particularly Cambodians and Montagnards, and now some of the newer Asian groups. It's a tougher go to really work your way up because you're not going to become proficient in English in an equitable way. But things that the faith communities are doing have included not only doing initial resettlement, but some of the work we were involved in is that we tried to help the immigrant communities establish their own faith communities. And then we would give them support in helping with immigrant integration. A couple of examples. When the Cambodians first came, this is going back into the early 80s, they were suffering dramatically from post-traumatic stress due to the genocide of Cambodia, and Western mental health could not do anything to help. And so in interviewing them, they indicated, well, we need a monk, we need a monk. We were able to get a grant from a large foundation in North Carolina, the C. Smith Jones Foundation, to fund culturally appropriate mental health services. And so through that grant, they got a monk, and then they came together and coalesced. They raised their own money to buy land, and now they've got 10 acres. And that's one Buddhist temple in Greensboro, and now, and it started off as Cambodian, then it began to serve the Lao, and then a separate Lao temple spun off a separate Cambodian temple, so that now it's just like regular Protestant churches. There's about 4 or 5 different Buddhist temples. Mosques had a similar story. We were not instrumental in organizing the mosques, but with the large influx particularly of African refugees, that triggered the largest mosque in Greensboro that is serving people. And through our AmeriCorps program, we would do things like provide an AmeriCorps member to the mosque, and their role on one level would be to organize English as a second language classes at the mosque, information and referral services, but it was also teaching members of the mosque how to deal with Western systems, how to file reports, how to seek out grants. And so it began to spin off in those kinds of ways. A similar thing happened with several evangelical churches that emerged with other refugee groups. The Montagnards, who are now number approximately 7,000 in Greensboro, have 5 different churches. 4 of them are evangelical Protestant, and they compete with each other, but in the competition they all grow and flourish. And is also a Catholic church that serves primarily Montagnards. So I think you can see this pattern. Now you can see Congolese, French-speaking churches emerging, mostly in the evangelical Protestants. The Catholic Church is more adept at including new groups and setting up a separate mass or finding a bilingual priest to bring them in. And then you also see some other special organizations that have emerged. Now, cite one. It's called Faith Action International House. It came together a little over 10 years ago in Greensboro. A Methodist minister organized it as an interfaith board. Their focus is specifically to provide services and do advocacy targeting immigrants and refugees. And so these are all resources in Greensboro that serve primarily the refugee population. I think you can see similar stories in other big cities where refugees are. The Latino story, Latino immigrant story, is a different story, but eventually it's in the process of coalescing with some of the systems that are there. Latinos were in North Carolina since after World War II, mainly in the migrant labor stream, were invisible to most of mainstream North Carolina. That began to change, particularly after 1986, with the Immigration Reform Act there, which created a pathway to citizenship for migrant seasonal farm workers. And these guys, and approximately 100,000 people have moved through North Carolina every year in the farm labor seasonal work. Most of them being Latino, mostly from Mexico, mostly undocumented. But documented, people who became documented, then moved out of the stream, settled particularly not in rural areas, but in urban pockets around the state. Every county now has a Latino population, and a lot of them are first or second generation immigrants, but primarily in urban areas where there were manufacturing jobs and construction jobs. And so that really started after 1986. In 2000 census, North Carolina was recorded as having the largest rate of increase of Hispanics of any state in the Union. It doesn't mean we have a whole lot, but it means that our rate of increase was dramatic. I think people Hispanic business maybe around 700,000 now, and probably 3/4 of those are from Mexico, and probably over half are undocumented. So this other clientele, which in some cases does not have legal status, cannot access the human services that other refugees and citizens can, has developed its own faith network, starting off with Catholic churches, and then gradually spreading over into evangelical Protestant churches that were Hispanic organized. And then gradually, some of the more progressive other Protestant churches began to reach out to the Latino community, so you began to see them employing a Latino pastor in addition, setting up additional kinds of services and activities. And this has continued to happen, and the positive thing that I see happening as these mainstream churches become involved, they become more keenly aware of the justice issues and the special needs that are impacting the undocumented immigrant community. And so you see gradually church people becoming a little bit more progressive in speaking up and doing advocacy work. Let me move on briefly to a couple of the other questions that Elzbieta posed. One had to do with the role of faith-based educational institutions and how active were they. And to give examples again from the Greensboro area, I can think of, we have 4 colleges and universities in our county that have a faith-based heritage, and each of them has played a unique role. Guilford College has been, which is a Quaker college, has had a strong sense of social justice, and their students since the early 90s have been very active in doing not just service learning, but really social justice issues in cooperation with various immigrant and refugee communities. And so a large number of students go out each year and organize activities in immigrant neighborhoods, after-school tutoring, women's ESL classes and things like that. Other colleges participate too, but particularly the Guilford College students. It started with a couple of Guilford College students who became AmeriCorps members, and really got into it, and then they carried the organizing skills, or the skills may have been there, they carried the vision back to their campus, and that has carried on strongly from Guilford College. Another local college is Bennett College, historically African American female college, a Methodist college, and they have provided some volunteers. I think their contribution has been more, they have taken a stand historically for justice. They allowed Martin Luther King to speak there when the city would not let him come in and speak. And while they've not been as active on the ground, their force as a moral force for the community has been strong. A couple of their presidents have been very outspoken in saying how the community should reach out to the Latino population in particular. Greensboro College, another small Methodist college. There are two Methodist colleges in town. This was the historically white one. They created the first master's program in ESL about 10 years ago. So it became a major resource as ESL emerged as a vocational track for the public schools. And then the last one I would mention is Elon University, which has its roots in the UCC, recently opened a campus in Greensboro, a new law school. And just last month, they opened an immigration law center where they will specialize providing services to immigrants. And so law students, as part of their training, in cooperation with a certified immigration counselor, will provide immigration assistance to the large population. We estimate there's probably 60,000 people in our little city of 300,000, about 60,000 people who live in immigrant families. So it's been fairly significant. The third question that was posed has to do with positive examples of local government working together with faith communities. I try to think of good examples. A couple of examples I have are probably not as directly linked, but I think there is a connection. In particular, right now the refugee program in Greensboro is struggling. The biggest and oldest resettlement agency in town, Lutheran Family Services, recently closed its doors for some internal problems it was having, not because of external problems. And most of the other resettlement agencies have really relied on the systems that Lutheran Family Services had built up in terms of running a newcomer school for new arrivals, in terms of running other kind of special activities. And so this created a crisis, and the Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro, a local community foundation, has anteed up some money for a steering committee and working with city government to do community needs assessment, where everyone already knows what the needs are, but we always start right there, and to set up a new system that would be a community integrated system for resettling refugees who are having a much harder time than usual because of the economy in particular. And because the local congregations who used to provide so much money are not able to do that. So people are not finding jobs right away. They're not able to pay their rent for 3 months. But the Community Foundation, which is working with civic leaders, has provided some upfront money. And you can also see other foundations. A local health foundation has provided some money which is addressing the same issue, and they have funded a congregational nursing system where nurses are assigned to congregations, including immigrant congregations, to provide direct health services in this time of particular crunch. So those are the things I would like to lift up from North Carolina in particular, and I think I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Fariyal Sharif, and I teach at Howard University in the School of Social Work. And my presentation is based on my work within my masjid, my local Jamaat, for the last 25 years. As you are all aware, there are many Muslim communities. A word that commonly used by the Shia among the Muslims for the community is Jamaat, and we always interchangeably use that word to represent our community. The Jamaats rarely participate explicitly in the immigration policy debate. When Elzbieta posed that question, I said, oh, we don't in the policy debate, but we are very actively involved internally for the integration of our communities to the American society. And I'm using the word integration rather than assimilation because the later may imply that the minority group loses its cultural distinction, and sometimes we jokingly say among ourselves that this is a Judeo-Christian society, and maybe 100 years from now this will be a Judeo-Christian Muslim society. And this is clearly to indicate that we are here to stay, and we are contributing members of this society. And I want to share with you some of what I've learned about the grassroots efforts to link, to promote immigrant integration. And as I said, I've been here for over 30 years as an immigrant social activist within one of the Jamaats and as a social program consultant to several other Jamaats. And here in the United States, we don't see the distinction between the Shias and the Sunnis or the Naqshbandis and the Ismailis and the Ishnashis that we used to see in our countries of origin. Somehow we come together much more here, and we try to look for common grounds, and we find that common grounds within the ethics of Islam. My observations are also grounded in my professional experience as a researcher and as a professor, and I've been at it for past 20 years. Dr. Gozdziak taught with me for 7 years in terms of refugees and immigrants. I'm pointing this out because I'm using all that we learn in our work from the university. I was telling Alex, I use your work in my community activities all the time because the community is more, and this is not only true of Ismaili community that I work with, but several Muslim communities are trying to professionalize its work and activities. And just to relate to what Dr. Cox referred at the beginning, that the young people can be linked to our religious work, not in the form of practices of faith, like the regular practices, day-to-day prayers. They do relate to it, but they much more relate to religiosity, the volunteerism, and other activities that signify the ethics of the faith. I have two main points that I hope you will take away from this brief presentation. First, Muslim American communities are very diverse. Just there is no Muslim world globally, and there is no monolithic Muslim community. And you saw this during the past few weeks in Egypt, you are seeing it in Libya, you're seeing it in Yemen, all over. There is no one Muslim community. Most of the Muslim American communities and most individual Muslims have a pluralistic outlook regarding both religion and culture, and this enables them to adapt effectively to the American ideals of diversity and pluralism. Second, the Jamaats are investing heavily. We are investing our time, knowledge, and resources to programs that assure that our own members, most of whom are immigrants, will be productive and contributing members of American society, both as individuals and as active participants and in civil society organizations. And we heavily focus at the linking level, Alex, to the connection with the civil society organizations. Most of our programs are developed by specialists in the program topical area and follow professional standards for planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Now I want to turn to the next point, which is diversity and pluralism. About 1/4 of the Muslim, or 1/4 to 1/3 are American Muslims, Americans who are African Americans. The rest of the our main communities from all over the world, mainly first or second generation immigrants. And we are from South and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Central Asia, and Europe. Thus, the languages, customs, and traditions are highly diverse. Most of the Muslim American Jamaats at both the local and national levels are diverse in terms of language, ethnicity, and cultures. Many of these communities are organized locally around. Most of our work is organized around our mosques, our masjids, and we follow one of the tarikats or sect of Islam, and most of our work is within our tarikat. However, our religious perspectives are very pluralistic, whether we are pluralistic or dogmatic, in my experience, even those who are more dogmatic, they believe in religious and political pluralism. To be clear, I would say that by pluralism I mean that our attitudes and numerous pathways to God are valid. So we just don't say that our pathway is the only way to God. And that numerous political philosophies can lead to laudable social organizations and governance. Although we are pluralistic and diverse, we have some common tenets that we follow, and those are within the ethics of our religion. And I have always emphasized, whether I'm working nationally, locally, or even transnationally, when I'm working in Afghanistan or Pakistan, I would remind my congregation that we need to focus on our ethics, which deal with humility, piety, environmental stewardship, active compassion for the poor. We really focus on the poor and dispossessed within the community. Responsibility for the welfare of the elderly, and many other such ethics that we focus on when we work inwardly. And we say that while our obligations are first to our families, then to the Jamaat, then on to the wider community where we live, and then on to the nation, and finally to the world. So we use the term Ummah, and you must have heard that word Ummah. We use it again and again, whether it's within the local Ummah, or the national Ummah, or the international Ummah. This leads to my second theme, which deals with the programs. Which leads to the programs that are really critical. And our programs are within 4 domains. The first domain, which we call, is access domain, which has to deal with income, education, health, and housing, so that any newcomer will first work with the access domain. The next domain, which Alex called as social capital domain, and I refer to it as social connection domain, which deals with building social networks and participation within the community, and then moving on to the outer communities. The third domain we deal with is removal of structural barriers, which deals with language and some aspects of culture. Now, one advantage that we have is, since the membership in our Jamaats, in my own Jamaat, there are Afghans, Iranians, East Africans, Indians, Pakistanis, you name it. There are so many countries represented. So we all speak different languages. And the only language that we have our training programs in our discussions are in English. So we want to make sure, even for the elderly, we have classes in English, because you can't have any discussions unless you have a common language. So we have an advantage of having English as a language to work with. So we remove barriers within the community, but that helps us deal with barriers outside the community too. And we also deal with some aspects of our culture, and we make a special effort to help within the community to understand what are the ethics in relation to the religion and what are the aspects of the culture that we bring in. So what an Afghan brings to my Jamaat is very different from an East African brings to my Jamaat. It's different from what an Indian brings to my Jamaat. And yet we have that common tariqa with our religious faith, and we have to find common ground. And that's what really is helpful, and we discuss issues of our culture that are very negative that we bring here. And issues of the culture here that you might find are not acceptable to us. So our discussions, our commonality comes around the ethics of faith. Oh, I have to finish? Okay, I'll finish in 2 minutes. So I pointed out some of the issues that are important. I want to give you 2 examples of programs. And these are structured, well-developed programs. And the first one is this summer program for youth, which is different from the irregular weekly programs that go on in the Jamaat. And then the second one we call is Golden Age Club, and Golden program which deals with the elderly who have most challenges with social isolation and feeling of helplessness or hopelessness. And again, when I'm organizing this program, I remember one time I organized a program on elderly, and I invited Dr. Gozdziak to come and talk to my group about what are the issues that we need to consider. But I want to point out that we are not, while we are very inward, we also deal with what is available within the community. The Alumma program started as a result of concern of several mothers regarding Muslim identity development of our teenage boys and girls who attended public schools and lived in predominantly non-Muslim environments. The immigrant parents were struggling to cope with their own adult integration issues and were not confident that their children, being highly susceptible to peer influences from the dominant culture, were being guided adequately. We were concerned about gangs in our community. We were concerned about our children going to the malls. Anyway, we ended up developing a program, and this is a summer program that has been in operation for over 20 years, and this program has been kind of adapted for many communities. Sikhs do it, Hindus do it, so that several communities have developed programs inwardly for their own group to maintain their faith, to maintain the cultural, positive aspects of their culture, but make sure that you become a part of the American culture and you are contributing part of the American culture. I think I've run out of time. Thank you.
Hopefully not least, I hope you are not asleep. Thank you, Fariyal. This brings back really nice memories when Fariyal and I were working together, and when Raleigh and I were studying together. And I was thinking, since I was involved in organizing all of this, I was thinking, well, should I adhere to the same 3 questions, or should I throw in a wrench? Here, and I think I want to do a little bit of both. I want to add to what my esteemed colleagues were saying, and almost everybody in one way or the other, as well in the policy debate in the morning as earlier as now, we all, and in anthropology in particular, we pay such close attention to place, right, to context. That is very important. And for the most part, you heard about pluralistic things, pluralistic faith-based organizations, many different religions coming together, helping, facilitating integration. And I want to throw in a wrench and make you think about the challenges of immigrant integration in a context where there is one dominant religion. And in the study that Raleigh and I were involved in some years ago, we looked at Utah. And when you engage immigrants, particularly immigrant women, in discussion, to what extent, you coming from somewhere else with a different religion, with a different culture, to a place that is religiously and therefore maybe politically rather homogeneous and quite patriarchal on top of that, does that facilitate or impede your integration? And we heard stories of, both in the sort of existential realm. My favorite story to tell is always about women, immigrant and refugee women, when we were sitting around and they were saying, look, the most discriminatory way and the least, the way in which we least feel like we belong here, because integration is belonging as well, is that we are told that we cannot reach salvation because we're not Mormon, and because we don't have that secret name by which our husbands in heaven will be calling us in. So what do we do? And that is, you can think, oh, this is a funny anecdote, and but that was a very profound existential kind of a discussion where women were saying, well, we are not allowed to partake. And then one of our colleagues who was working with us on the project wrote a chapter on at the gates of the kingdom. At the gates, but not in the kingdom. And the religious tenets are really forbidding us to even think about, integrating into that kingdom. And then, they would translate that to more practical things, and that is, with immigrant women, for example, who wanted to, who are victims of domestic violence and would want to call the police or, something like that. Well, they said, we don't do any of this because we don't feel that we are going to be respected and that our needs are going to be taken into consideration because the patriarchy is so close related to the church that they felt that those were extreme stumbling blocks, in the integration processes. So you have, we've painted so far a very positive picture of faith-based organizations facilitating immigrant integration, but we cannot forget that there are also examples, and I don't know them from the Mormon Church by any stretch of the imagination, because my own church is also not always doing right by women. And women would be, immigrant women would be the ones that will often say, I am all about religion and about spirituality, but not necessarily about the religious institutions. And this is the wrench that I think I want to throw into my own presentation, because both in my, I'm an immigrant just like Fariyal, and I always tease that, I study immigrant integration, but I also practice it. I also parent the second generation. So that's my claim to fame. And we had in the morning, in the before session, we had a lot of discussion about the sort of, what Alejandro Cortez and Ruben Rambert always remind us, that in this country we don't have a crown and don't have that history to which we look, but language is the thing that unites us. And for 30 years, I believed in it. And now I'm enrolled in a Spanish class because I don't feel integrated any longer. Particularly because, I am surrounded. I live in Columbia Heights, if you know Washington, and 3/4 of my neighbors speak Spanish, and even those that speak English in a meaningful exchange. It's language. They want to do it in Spanish. And I say about my own linguistic abilities that after 30 years of living in this country, there are two things that I don't do in English. And I only speak Polish on a daily basis to my dogs. But the other two things are praying and reading poetry. I don't think I will ever appreciate English poetry. And I certainly don't think of, the Virgin Mary, because we don't really believe in God. As a Polish Catholic, the Virgin Mary does not understand English. So this is the kind of funny anecdote. But the thing that I want to get back to is religion and spirituality. And I think one of the realms that has also a great deal of possibilities for faith-based organizations to get involved in is to look to what extent religion, not the institution, and spirituality is a coping mechanism, is a strategy for integration. And Raleigh talked a lot about refugees, you know, and you were thinking particularly in forced migration and, you know, all the drama and trauma of that. I mean, most people, many theorists will say that migration in general is an existential issue. So if you deal with an existential issue, shouldn't we be invoking also religious beliefs and spirituality to somehow deal with it? And most of my work, both as a former policymaker in the Office of Refugee Resettlement and in my research, I focus on the social service / mental health programming that we all try to establish and promote as the institutions that would facilitate immigrant integration. And yet, we are looking at a very secular biomedical model that medicalizes these experiences and are not looking at these experiences as the spiritual experience and not tapping into. I mean, all the voluntary agencies, yes, many, obviously, you know, they're faith-based organizations, but look at what kind of services, who provides whatever component of service that will say, okay, this is a mental health program, like the temple that you were talking about. But do we really incorporate religion and spirituality in it? Or are we trying to figure out what makes people pick religiously and then park the religion, you know, on the side and still go with our very Western, very biomedical, very secular kind of an approach? I looked in my research also at you know, how the helping professions in general, 90% of Americans, who that name is not here because you probably will correct me, 90% of, or some who are there, of Americans profess a belief in some higher power. And yet, only 31% of mental health professionals, social workers profess a belief in some higher power. And those are the helping professions that are now trying to deal with this existential crisis of an immigrant. I'm not suggesting that you have to be a believer in the same religion, but you have to have an appreciation of religion. And then when you throw in the gender issue into the equation, you know, we cannot also forget that some of these faith-based organizations come with what Fariyal was talking about. We come to the Ummah, to the Jamaat, with, you know, to the Catholic community, with cultural notions that have nothing to do with religion, but that have to do with patriarchy, with oppression, you know, with inequality of women. And so where is the balance, and how we do now juggle with saying, okay, immigrant women also should avail themselves of the services of the faith-based organization, but what if the faith-based organization is looking down because of the cultural aspect of the faith, is looking down on that woman or on that family and that kind of stuff. So I'm inviting you to be thinking of, you know, where's the basic? Where is the, how can we? And, you know, one of my questions was, how can educational institutions, for example, play a role? When Fariyal and I were working together a long time ago, we did a survey of you know, departments and schools of who teaches on immigration issues. And we surveyed 1,700 different departments around the country. It was very telling because every school of law had an immigration law program, and you can make money on it. But virtually at that point, and that was 20-some years ago, at that point, virtually no medical school was having any content that would deal with, you know, again, health and illness and well-being and disease are conceptual things that deal with culture and with existential kind of things. They're not, you know, not some Kant's ideas, you know, floating up there. So the educational institutions should probably be thinking about, well, I am going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a nurse, I'm going to be a social worker, treating somebody who came from somewhere else with very different concepts of the world, with very different worldviews. So I think there's a room there for saying, well, let's engage in a discourse and in a critical discourse on the medicalization of migration. That this is some sort of a mental health emergency that needs to be dealt with through the very Western biomedically based interventions, as opposed to giving the people a role, as opposed to looking to the communities. I myself come from a country that talk about suffering as peoples, not individuals, but as peoples, and somehow we survive as folks. What made us survive? What are the indigenous coping strategies that immigrant groups bring with themselves, with them? And what we now, as the integrated or semi-integrated Americans, in my case, can learn from. So that's my invitation to this, to have that dialogue with you. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This has been a fascinating journey across the world and across the country and across the issues. I must say, Elzbieta, I'm a little frustrated because you asked all the questions.
But they already answered them all, and I said, well, I'm not going to repeat.
But I think they were largely rhetorical questions, that the answers seem to be no by implication. Well, we have, I think, about 15, 20 minutes for this dialogue, which has been invited. So let me open it up. Let's have a conversation. You can all move up if you'd like and be closer. So, yes.
Raleigh, I actually have a question for you about when you were talking about the church structures in North Carolina. You talked about how the Catholic Church tended to include new groups, whereas the Protestant churches were more popping up with new church structures. How does that interact with the integration or lack thereof of refugees?
Examples that I'm thinking of would be that some of the churches, well, they will have the Spanish Mass in the afternoon, English Mass in the morning, or in another case, Vietnamese and French, they get the French afternoons. So they are all in the same church, but they try things like potluck dinners and things like that. And I should say that we, meaning like America, in our programs, we use these faith communities as an avenue to reach people. Not around spiritual issues, but around how you can access help the partner. But I don't know that it works well, though it's pretty striking to have a congregation that has a Congolese congregation and a Vietnamese congregation and one congregation, all in the same group.
So do you think it makes a difference that they're all in the same building?
Actually, I have an example of that. First, to remind you of a quote you probably all know, Martin Luther King was the one who said, Sunday morning is the most segregated moment. And in the research that we've done, that is generally the case, that even though one particular church may have multiple languages coming to it, they enter and exit and hardly say hello to each other, and hardly really integrates them in fashion. But leaders, again, what I was talking about, can make a difference. And there's an example, actually, of a Polish Catholic church in Philadelphia that was founded by the Polish immigrants 100 years ago. And then new immigrants started coming in the 70s. And it began just like this, where they were completely segregated from each other. But the priest tried to make a difference. And he turned it over to the lay leadership, which was second and third generation Polish women at that time, to do some sort of cultural event, potluck or something that would bring everybody together. And the first time they did it, actually, they organized it in sort of what would be, for any of you who have children in PTAs or in churches and organize things like this, there's always a core group of people who do all the work, and so this core group of women did all the work and just invited the new immigrant people to participate. And it was actually a failure. They had thought would be a great success is that the kids would do the national dances and stuff. But what happened was the Mexicans would come in and do the national dances, the Mexican parents would watch, and then both of them would leave, and then the Poles would come in and do it, and then both of them would leave, you know. So it was just like Mass on Sunday, just that happened to be on Saturday night or something instead. But the priest was a smart priest. He said, okay, now what we're going to do this time is we're going to do this again. But rather than just you, the old hardline group of women who I know are dedicated and do all the work in here, you have to form an organizing committee that includes members of each of these different groups. And you have to work together for at least 6 months, meeting once a week to plan this organization. And lo and behold, you know, the women in that little group became best friends. They started sharing recipes, talking about their kids. And then they also made this great innovation in the entertainment, which was the Mexicans would come in and do one dance, but then the Mexicans would come back later to do another dance, so that the Mexican parents had to sit through all the other parents doing other dances, and everybody at the end then participated in the buffet, and it brought people together. So it really was a matter of having that face-to-face interaction and in an equal position, because the first time it was like the old line Polish women were telling people what to do, rather than saying, you're our equals, we want to share the work together. So I think that part, you know, equality and with leadership figuring that out makes a difference.
Is another lesson from that the women are...
The women are absolutely critical. Yeah, you know, I mean, this is a Catholic church, as Elzbieta said, doesn't always have a great record on men. You know, the leader was a male priest, of course, because that's the only kind they have. But all the day-to-day work of social type stuff, indeed, was done by the women.
So that's true of every faith we've ever seen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dialogue amongst the mosques may be an exception.
No, in fact, I was going to say what happened in our mosque, the Central Asians, the Afghans and Tajiks just would not come to the place where the South Asians. And finally, the breakthrough came through social activities, you know, the showers that women give for babies and all those things. And showers, parties, and it's these women, young women who organize it. And that's where we started talking to each other. And then when English language classes came for the elderly, these Afghan women were not coming to the mosque for the activities. So this teacher went to their neighborhood to teach English. And it was only through, it wasn't religious practice or faith activities that brought us together. The beginning came with the social activities at human level, and the most critical was the funeral of the old Papa, father of all men, and the Shias in Afghanistan do their funeral rites very differently from the way South Asians were. And the 5 of us who were standing, and I said to the leader, the head who was the man, and I said, please don't say anything about the funeral. If somebody figures out that their father is not going to heaven, we are all in trouble. So we went along with everything that was the Afghan style and said, now come to the mosque in the evening and we'll do the common style. So it's interesting that and I learned out of that, don't say anything about critical events, birth, death, and marriages. They've got to be together. And it's the social activities that brought us together. That created ties, and that were done by women.
So something in common, yes.
Philip Connor, Pew Forum, which I'm quite glad. I'm struck, and I want to kind of take maybe the wrench a little further. I'm struck by the positive tone that exists across the panel for religion as being a positive and more good force for immigrants. This doesn't strike me as always the same thing we get in media and rhetoric or in discourse, for example, particularly when it comes across for non-Christian groups. And so I just wanted to get a sense from your experiences of, are there ways, just to kind of flip it for a moment, that religious organizations or religion as a whole in the United States can serve negatively on immigrant incorporation? Or is it totally a positive story? I'm not coming at it from a bias or a slant, it's an interesting story.
I had something of the same question listening to these heartwarming. So why don't we just go one after another with
Yes,
With
so-
horror stories.
So, right.
not horror stories, but
Right,
at least a balance.
Any of us who
a
listen to
balance
the
of-
media, of course, can come up with negative examples of people with narrow religious minds who manage to create division. And Fariyal was referring to sort of the same thing within Islam. The sects can be divided by people saying things like that. So, yeah. So there's no doubt that can happen. One of the things that as someone who has always been concerned with sort of social justice issues, that always, I think, is a basic injustice in the world, is that in my experience, the positive things in these immigrant congregations are much more numerous than these negative things that exist. But the negative ones have such bigger impact. Just a few negative things really reverberate tremendously and take a lot of work to overcome. So I've seen, indeed, examples of where congregations try to come together over something. It can be, for example, even among Haitians. In the wake of the earthquake in Haiti, there was an unprecedented religious gathering that included Catholics, Protestants, and people who worship the spirits of the voodoo. That never happened before. But it didn't happen in the States. In the States, there were still people who some of the evangelical Christians who would say that, this was the wrath of God, and these people who believe in voodoo, or the people who are Catholics, it's their fault in some way that this happened. So those things just are really frustrating, and indeed they do exist.
You want to?
Well, I don't want to dump on my own church, full disclosure. I was raised, born, and will die Catholic. But, I am fascinated by the two issues. I live in Columbia Heights, and 16th Street is, every church imaginable that you can think of. And there's many Central American, South American immigrants that, culturally, that they were raised Catholic. And somehow, they're jumping the ship and they're going somewhere else. So there must be something that the church is not providing. On the other hand, you have communities and people in my own neighborhood that I know that, on Saturday night they are the Seventh-day Adventists, but on the Sunday morning they are at Sacred Heart because they will say to me, well, if one church is good, two are better, But so there is some tension there. But then you also have, I think Ayuaong, she writes also about how, for example, the Mormon church, perhaps to me this is not the most gender-friendly and women-friendly church, but how Cambodian women and other immigrant women are going and worshiping there, not necessarily for the worship, but for the kind of things that Fariyal was talking about, because if they come from very patriarchal, very strict women's role kind of image of what it is to be a woman, they cannot take leadership roles within their own ethnic community, not necessarily faith community, but just ethnic community. So they go to the church because there they can, sweep the floor of the church or cook the potluck or, take on some roles. So you have, this kind of tension. I got into this religion thing on the research side when I was in ORR and we settled the first cohort of Iraqis after the first Gulf War. And a lot of them went to Dearborn and to Michigan and that kind of stuff. And there was the same kind of stuff that you were talking about. Oh, well, there's a lot of these Caribbean Christians there, so they're giving up of us, but this is this sect, that's this sect. And we even paid for the imams to do some programming, and it was still working, Something's got to be something. And I was remembering, all of our work together. And then it turned out that one of the wife of one of the imams, she was a social worker, and we then put her on contract and had her, do things because the women that were saying, you know, that imam, he doesn't understand us. He doesn't understand what it is to be a woman, and a woman facing all these integration challenges that maybe I was a stay-at-home, you know, not work outside of home kind of a person, and now the Office of Refugee Resettlement tells me I must become very quickly economically self-sufficient. And I also realized that if I don't go to work, my family is going to starve. You know? And they were not getting from the leadership that sort of buy into that it is okay for a woman to go, and maybe to go outside the home and work. Maybe the community should be thinking about what kind of work. Maybe the young girls shouldn't be going and working in the evening and coming home unchaperoned. But you can massage this. But the imam was just so not into the gender issue. So the white imam, she just said, I don't listen to him. I've been married to him for 30 years and I don't listen to him all that much. And then we empowered her to be working with women. And things were happening. But it's not I don't think it's a rosy picture, altogether. And then, to think about what Diana Egg writes about, how many immigrants who come from very strict religious kind of congregations and communities come here to, as she says, breathe the sigh of relief, right? To really live in a much more secularized kind of way. So they just don't want it. Think about how many Catholics are from more traditional kind of Catholic churches that come here and are divorced, and embrace sort of more of the freedom and not the rejection and the condemnation that used to community practice in some fashion and that kind of stuff. So it's not always.
You're pointing out ills of any groups of people. I don't think any group of people or any race group is perfect. There are problems. So in my own group, I can say there might be domestic violence, there might be mental health problems. Children might get into situations that parents are not happy. But what is useful here, because of we are part of the faith-based organization, and I should give my own bias. I'm a feminist. I'm really concerned that Islam gives many rights to women, and Muslim women are very powerful women. It's a public face and a private face you need to understand. And we don't give our private face to outsiders, but we do give to ourselves, and so knowing what we know as public and private life as a member of the community, we make a number of us, and this is not just in my own mosque, but many mosques, women have come together and said, we are concerned about our own, and we try to influence. So in that sense, I think we are playing a very positive role in the integration of our own community.
But it's all, isn't it like, in all these theories on immigrant integration, particularly in anthropology, that, well, we say, is the ethnic community a good community to get a job and to, but then there is no upward mobility if you stay within the ethnic community. So when is the congregation good for the immigrant? I think we need to put also a timeline on it. Because as your own thinking about stuff evolves, people might be jumping from the ethnic church to a different church. I do know you will not see me in a Polish church in Silver Spring. No, thank you very much. The priest is so communist that never, But I used to go there because early on, you were looking to the church for something different. You look for the ability to speak Polish, to feel at home, to ease the transition. But 30 years later, it doesn't serve the role that you want. So I think that also changes over time. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Raleigh.
Well, I was going to say, first of all, Elzbieta gave us biased questions. They're all leading questions about what are the
Those were
positive
Tom's
things.
questions.
Because we're looking for positive centers. But I think in North Carolina it's easy because that's still the language of the community.
Right.
And it's also easy to look at the ethics of any world religion and talk about helping the sojourner or loving your neighbor and empowering people to focus on that. I think there is a real positiveness. I can think of many conflicts, and some of them are kind of funny. Okay? Several years ago, we did a summer youth program for Montagnard youth, and we did it at the Buddhist temple. Well, I think a lot of these kids were afraid that food would be poison or something like that. Buddhist food was somehow different from Montagnard food. But they learned it wasn't, and it was a great soccer team, so they got past their anti-Buddhist. Now, right now, we're dealing with the Nepalese Bhutanese community that's just come to Greensboro. They want to organize as a community, like grant community foundations. 80% want it to be as a kind of a Hindu temple. 20% are evangelical Protestants. We're not so big on this idea. Plus, as it turns out, the evangelical Protestants with a little caste, caste. So there's a class discrimination. We'll see what happens.
Don't you think that, I think about world religions, all of them have this component, that's a sort of overarching component of obligations to the less fortunate, obligation to your neighbor, and have a sort of a non-relativist worldview, if I can put it that way. They have certain absolutes that seem to me would dictate there's some that they couldn't sink to the kind of animus that you would have outside those religions. And then secondly, I'd like to know what you think about this in the immigrant context. It seems to me that one of the reasons that religion has flourished in America is that, according to the Baylor study, 40% of adult Americans have changed their religion. In America, if your religion of origin no longer meets your needs, you are free, without fear of recrimination or worse, to change to a faith that meets your needs, that you're comfortable with. So, it's a voluntary. You voluntarily embrace this, which makes you usually a more enthusiastic adherent.
Voluntarily, and there are lots of opportunities out there.
And if it's not one, you can start one. And you can start one.
That's right.
We're coming to the end of the panel, so let me just see how many other questions there are that people would like to ask. Well, if not, let me ask one last question. I was at a meeting in actually the Netherlands a few years ago, and the dean of this academic institution pointed out that it had come as a great surprise to the leaders of the institution to find that maybe 80% or 90% of the students cared a great deal about their religion and were inspired and motivated by it. And he reflected and said, the staff of the institute, probably 50, 60%, but of the faculty, it's maybe 3 to 4%. So I was very struck by your comment about the 31% of caregivers who might have a very different worldview, and wondered if you could comment a little bit on whether we're seeing sort of almost generic groupings of people that work either for or against.
Well, there's a lot of studies. I had actually a chapter in the book, Not Born a Refugee Woman. So the chapter is Pray God and Keep Walking, when I'm unpacking the whole idea of gender and religion and identity and that kind of stuff. And when you look at, it's striking that it is in the mental health field, for lack of a better, more precise term, and physical health, they're very different attitudes. Because when you look at the research, cancer research, for example, even the doctors who are not necessarily very religious themselves, or agnostic or whatnot, see the value of prayer, for example, in the treatment modality to much greater extent than a psychiatrist or a psychologist who deals with existential issues and does not want to incorporate verses from the Quran or verses from the Bible, or just to look at how that person might be perceiving the suffering that happened to them. So there's some disconnect, and there have been studies also when psychiatrists in particular went to training on sort of religious appreciation, not to convert to anything, and still be an agnostic or a naturalist or whatever, but you have, just like we want to do cultural competence training, I hate that. When they gain a much better appreciation and were able to ask very different kind of questions of the client, the pain, and recognize that how that person sees that suffering is oftentimes through religion, and that oftentimes it is religion that helped, people survive, or just the other way around. When you read Elzbieta, when does he write that the flames of the concentration camp swallowed his God? He was a very religious person at some point in his life. He was no longer. So it was the old question, that sometimes these horrible events make you lose religion. But in our training, I'm an educator for all my life. I'm thinking that we are, even in this college, even in this university, ask them, I guess they have to take, right, one religion course, Georgetown students too, but we are not very good at incorporating religion. In a religious university, 52% of our students claim to be Catholic, or their parents. Because they're the ones that pay
I
the
just did that because
tuition.
they thought they'd have a better chance of getting in.
Right. But that's a tension also, because you don't want to come across as some preacher, in your classroom. But at the same time, if I'm teaching medical anthropology, that kid might go to become an MPH, might go to med school, might go somewhere else. Shouldn't I, at the undergraduate level, already start having a discussion about, you're going to encounter, I don't care what you think about, what you believe, but you're going to encounter people for whom religion and spirituality are going to be very important. And in your healthy profession, you've got to study spirituality. There's just I don't see a way around it. No, we don't do a good job.
Make a short comment that in the Netherlands, and more so in the general population is very unchurched, extraordinarily.
Oh, France.
So in that context, and especially in the Netherlands, where most of the migrants are from countries where Islam is the dominant religion, then the younger folks are more likely to be religious than the people who are in the sort of educational institutions. That's not surprising to me. But in the United States, where people are much more likely to be religious, it's still in Miami likely to be the case that the students from immigrant backgrounds coming to the university, and ours is a state university, are still very likely to be religious. But one other aspect, especially of the youth, that harkens back to what Richard just said a few moments ago, is they are very likely to be at an age where they try out different religions. They're not completely pleased with what they grew up with, partially because it's so true to the old immigrant traditions, and they're more familiar with English now, and they would like at least bilingual services, if not English-only services. So they shop around when they're in college age.
Yeah, just to clarify the story that I was telling you, it's an international program, so people are coming from other parts of the world, and the main point that the head of the school was making was how blind they had been to these different realities, and to exactly the point that you're making, that it's important to the people. It doesn't matter whether it's important to you, it's important to the people. So let me thank you. You have one quick last question? Yes.
Yeah, it's sort of related, but it's a political question. Why haven't administrations publicly employed an integration program? I mean, it seems to me that's a political winner. People would receive it. They could partner with faith groups and really change the debate, seems to me. Now, they do it every now and then, but there's no overall national policy on integrating immigrants that I've seen.
Especially in contrast to Europe, where it is more self-conscious.
Yeah.
So, I mean, isn't that a smart idea, or am I missing something? And do they not think it's important? Or?
One anecdotal thing, George Bush, about 6 years ago, did have some faith-based initiatives he put into AmeriCorps. Excuse me, and we used them. And I got great joy out of recruiting imams and Buddhist monks to take part in the program, because I just don't think that's what he had in mind. But it was.
I'm not so sure about that. He's the first president to incorporate in his addresses mosques, temples, as well as churches, and he held a Muslim religious observance within weeks of 9/11. So that might be a little.
And actually, immediately in the wake of 9/11, he was explicit about saying it wasn't all Muslims that did this.
Now, your question is a very good one. I have the sort of sense that it's a bit of a rhetorical one.
Yeah, I mean,
So shall we leave it?
I teach a whole course on that.
oh, okay.
So why don't we leave that as the large question in the sense of what next? And this panel has been very positive. I think it's partly there was a selection bias, perhaps, as well as a bias in the question.
No, we're completely representative.
But it has
we
been.
represent the profession that has a lower percentage of people believing in God than the medical profession.
But it's been, I think, a very inspiring as well as an informative session. And so let's thank everyone here and thank all of you.